Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Sister Citizen by Melissa V. Harris Perry. We are currently on page 207. This segment is entitled The Political Consequences of Self-Reliance. Does the strong black woman imperative influence black women's politics? Remember that this book does not define politics narrowly as vote choice, partisan preference, or engagement with government entities. When I ask here about black women's politics, I'm asking about the constellation of ideas, beliefs, and attitudes that contribute to how black women see their relationship to society and the state. It is possible that attachment to self-reliance pushes black women in a politically conservative direction by encouraging a politics of self-help rather than one of structural change. The intuition is simple. To the extent that black women believe they are naturally endowed with a superhuman capacity to overcome life's obstacles, they may be less likely to support political agendas and public policies that seek to dismantle the structural barriers facing black women and more likely to support those aimed at individual empowerment. To test this hypothesis, I return to the 1995 Detroit area study. This time, instead of investigating life satisfaction, I want to know how the same beliefs and attitudes affect racial political ideas. I developed a scale titled, quote, "Get Over It," end quote. It is a 3-item scale that measures the belief that racial inequality stems more from individual effort than from structural barriers. The items used to generate the, quote, "Get Over It," end quote, scale are the respondents' level of agreement with 3 items. 1, discrimination against blacks is no longer a problem. 2, blacks have a tendency to blame whites too much for problems that are their own doing. And 3, many groups have worked their way up without special favors, and black people should do the same. Unsurprisingly, African Americans score lower overall on this scale than whites, but black women and men have an average score on this scale that is just above the midpoint, which means they are slightly more likely to be in agreement with these ideas than opposed to them. And there is as much variation among African Americans as among whites. The idea that racial inequality is more a matter of personal behavior than structural barriers has purchased among both blacks and whites. My analysis produced several findings I want to highlight. For African Americans, agreement with the, quote, "Get Over It," end quote, measure is negatively related to liberal political ideology. For all groups, agreement with this measure is positively associated with American patriotism. For black women, agreement with this measure is strongly, positively correlated with assumptions of self-reliance. This last relationship is present only among African American women. Unsurprisingly, black men and women who call themselves politically liberal are much less likely to agree that race discrimination is no longer much of a problem and that black people should simply work harder without pressing for government assistance. This effect is particularly powerful among black men. Yet white political liberalism was unrelated to this measure. Conservative and liberal whites are equally likely to feel that African Americans should get over issues of racial discrimination. Although political ideology is insignificant for white respondents in this model, patriotism is significantly and positively associated with the get over it variable for all groups. This provides some evidence of just world processing, the cognitive process of conforming one's views to the theory that the world is just, on the part of the patriotic respondents. Meritocracy is an important element of the American political and cultural landscape. It is likely that an attachment to the idea of a functioning meritocracy is an important aspect of American patriotism. The need to believe in a just world parallels the need to believe in meritocracy, a need that should be heightened among more patriotic respondents. If I am proud to live in America, I am more likely to discount information that America might be unjust. If African Americans do not benefit from the current structures, they, not the structures, must be to blame. Importantly, this patriotism effect works across race and gender categories, lending further support to the notion that it is a variation of pervasive just world effects. Research by social psychologists Zick Rubin and Ann Purplow shows that respondents who have a strong tendency to believe in a just world also tend to be more religious, more authoritarian, more conservative, more supportive of traditional social institutions, more likely to have negative attitudes towards underprivileged groups, and less compelled to engage in political or social action. This finding in the Detroit study data is only suggestive, but it points to real political consequences. The final important result from this model offers empirical support for the hypothesis that the strong black woman myth makes black women particularly susceptible to dispositional explanations for inequality. For them, the assumption of self-reliance is strongly and positively correlated with the get over it scale, more strongly than any other variable in the model. It has this effect only among black women. Agreement with the get over it scale, both for whites and for black men, is independent of their belief in self-reliance. But black women who assume that self-reliance is critical to personal success are significantly more likely to discount a continuing role of discrimination in explaining unequal life circumstances for African Americans. This result offers compelling evidence that, in addition to its emotional costs, the strong black woman myth has political consequences. Among this sample, it contributes to a worldview that not only asks a woman to demonstrate superhuman strength for family, friends, and community, but also discourages her from empathizing with the structural difficulties present in her own life and those of other black women. Okay, so let's have a reflection here. I think what stands out to me is the observation that most, I don't know if I should use most, but there are large portions of our country that are in denial of the structural, institutional, systematic, and systemic ways that racism affects everyday life. That the ways that racism puts a cap on how far up the masses of black people can rise, not how far up one individual can rise. And I always point out that no matter how far back you go, there were always examples of individual black people being able to break through the glass ceiling. But no matter how far back you go, you can never find examples of the masses of black people being able to break through that glass ceiling in the same way that masses of other uh, nationalities or groups of people have been able to break through some of these hindrances or prejudices that exist. And it's because of how deeply ingrained these institutional and structural forms of racism are. And what happens is that when people see individuals breaking through those glass ceilings, or when somebody is the individual who has broken through that glass ceiling, they begin to think that it's something that they did, that it's something that somebody else is doing wrong that's making it so that they can't break through the glass ceiling, as opposed to understanding that the person who broke through the glass ceiling is not the rule, they are the exception. Uh, and that's how Americanism works. It's the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that if you work as hard as if you just work your hardest, if you just try your hardest, if you just the American dream, you can be anything that you want to be here. When the truth of the matter is that most people who are born in lower class, the majority of them will die in lower class. Most people who are born in middle class will die in middle class. Most people who are born in upper class will die in upper class. There's very small amounts of movement in the class systems that exist here. And once you understand that, it makes you ask the question, well, why is that? And once you see that once you ask that question, you see that the majority of those people who are in that lower class are people who have systemic and institutional things holding them in those areas and keeping them in that subjugated, marginalized area. And that's why we cannot have an emphasis on in politics of individuality, but we must have an emphasis on politics of collectivism. Okay. Following this logic further, I tried to see whether these political implications also influence black women's policy choices. For this exploration, I used the 1999 Chicago African American Attitude Study, a questionnaire with an embedded experimental manipulation designed to test the policy effects of the strong black woman myth. The first page of the survey included measures of self-esteem, egalitarianism, and individualism. The experimental manipulation was introduced on the second page, in a scenario presented as a human interest news article about an African American single mother of two named Nikki. At random, subjects were shown one of 5 different versions of Nikki's story. Okay, this is an example of this. Okay, control group, unrelated story. In the control questionnaire, respondents read a news story entitled, quote, "A river runs through it," end quote. Excerpted. Why did I just put it excerpt? Oh, I'm sorry. In the control questionnaire, respondents read a news story entitled, quote, "A river runs through it," excerpted from the July 12, 1999 Newsweek article by the same name. The story concerns the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's decision to destroy a number of dams throughout the country and was thought to be unrelated to any of the variables of interest. Scenario 1. No help/good outcomes. In the first experimental questionnaire, a created scenario was presented as a human interest news story entitled, "One Woman's Story," end quote. The subject, Nikki, is a single mother of 2 who is working full-time, going to school, and trying to raise her 2 children. She shuns child support, government assistance, and offers of family help, and behaves in stereotypical, quote, "strong black woman," end quote, fashion. She faces some negative consequences, but overall her self-reliance leads to good outcomes. Scenario 2. No help, bad outcomes. In the second experimental questionnaire, the scenario is almost identical, except that Nikki's insistence on total self-reliance here brings more negative outcomes, and her strong black woman veneer is subjected to criticism. Scenario 3. Seeks help, good outcomes. In the third experimental questionnaire, Nikki actively seeks child support, accepts government job training, allows her family to help her financially, and reaches out to a community of friends for support. She is still admirable, but she is less the stereotypical, quote, "superwoman," end quote. These efforts to seek help lead to positive outcomes. Scenario 4. Seeks help, bad outcomes. In the fourth experimental questionnaire, the otherwise identical Nikki finds that asking for help creates negative consequences. Each respondent read one of the 5 possible stories. The survey questions then measured emotional reaction to the story, perceptions of Nikki and perceived closeness to her, and offered participants an opportunity to comment. The remainder of the survey asked for levels of support or opposition to public policies whose implementation would disproportionately affect black women and children. The proposals were in the areas of welfare, child support, child care, juvenile crime, and health care. In my analysis, I often collapse the 4 categories into 2. No help/good outcomes and seeks help/bad outcomes become traditional strong black woman. And no help/bad outcomes and seeks help/good outcomes becomes challenge to strong black woman. The imperative of strength suggests that black women should be able to handle life crises without help. The no help/good outcome scenario reinforces this view by validating the choice to be independent. The seeks help/bad outcome scenario also reinforces the traditional strength imperative by associating requests for assistance with negative consequences. The other 2 scenarios challenge the traditional strong black woman perspective by suggesting that independence can be negative and help can be positive. The survey thus allows me to explore how images of strong black women affect African American understandings of the social and political world. To determine if exposure to the Nikki scenarios makes black women less willing to support government interventions that assist black women and children, respondents were asked about their support for 10 different policy areas, including stricter welfare laws, government-provided health care, juvenile crime laws, and affirmative action. Their positions on several of these policies were significantly affected by exposure to the experimental manipulations. The traditional strong black woman scenarios elicited a higher level of support for stricter child support enforcement. Black women had a 92% probability of supporting this policy when they were exposed to traditional stories, compared to a 79% probability in the control group. Women exposed to traditional stories were more likely to support government-provided child care for poor parents. Among those who read a scenario with traditional ideas of black women's strength, the probability of supporting child care climbed from 81% to 97%. When exposed to scenarios that reinforce a traditional image of the strong black woman, Respondents were significantly harsher about punishing drug-addicted mothers. While the control group only had about a 1 in 3 probability of supporting this policy, more than half of those in the traditional group supported the proposal that, quote, crack mothers, end quote, should be imprisoned. Respondents who read traditional strength scenarios were also significantly more likely to support restricting welfare benefits for women who have more than 3 children. Although they were not more likely to support a time restriction on welfare benefits, Black women were more punitive on the issue of welfare and family size when they were exposed to traditional notions of Black women's strength. Only a quarter of those in the control group supported this restriction versus 44% of those in the traditional groups. These results suggest a few conclusions. In this sample, Black women's positions on these drug and welfare policies suggest that those who are primed to think about the positive symbol of strength are severely judgmental of other Black women whose behavior reinforces negative racial stereotypes. Women who have just been reminded of the, quote, strong Black woman, end quote, become harshly critical of the, quote, crack mother, end quote, and the, quote, welfare queen, end quote. The strong Black woman, a symbol embraced in opposition to the pejorative symbols of Black womanhood perpetuated by a hostile dominant culture, seems to intensify Black women's negative reactions to those symbols. While she operates as a point of pride and inspiration, she also seems to impel Black women toward more conservative policy positions and harsher political judgments against sisters who fail to meet the standards the myth imposes. A Black woman may need help from government and her children's father, but if she chooses to take crack or have additional children, she should be punished. Again, because these data are drawn from a small sample in a single city, they are only suggestive. But they point to the real and consequential ways that the strong Black woman narrative intervenes in Black political thought. Narratives that reinforce the idea that Black women can and should make it on their own strength have potentially conservative effects on African American policy positions. The image of mythic strength can focus Black attitudes on individual faults, shortcomings, and accountabilities, and may direct attention away from the communal responsibilities and strategies available to African Americans. The strong Black woman is a complicated cultural myth. On one hand, she is a deeply empowering symbol of endurance and hope. Her unassailable spirit is uplifting. Her courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity emboldens Black men and women when facing their own life challenges. But in her perfection, the strong Black woman is also harmful. Her titanic strength does violence to the spirits of Black women when it becomes an imperative for their daily lives. When seeking help means showing unacceptable weakness, actual Black women, unlike their mythical counterpart, face depression, anxiety, and loneliness. The strong Black woman is not meant to be Pollyanna. Rather, she is expected to show negative emotion, but that emotion is anger, not sadness. The neck-rolling, finger-snapping, tooth-sucking demands of an angry Black woman are entirely consistent with the myth of strength. But this no-nonsense, take-no-prisoners woman offers no expectation that the Black woman is supposed to be happy, content, or fulfilled. Her sometimes explosive anger is part of what distinguishes her from the ideal of white femininity. This right to own and express anger is among the more potentially powerful psychological and political elements of the construction of Black women's strength. That the Black woman is not denied an angry voice within an authentic definition of her femininity makes her a powerful ally for both Black men and white women in their political struggles. The emotional consequences for Black women are not solely individual. The mental health of marginalized people has important political implications. Feminist theorist Bell Hooks contends, quote, the mental health dilemmas of Black people are very real. They persist in our daily life, and they undermine our capacity to live fully and joyously. They even prevent us from participating in organized collective struggle aimed at ending domination and transforming society, end quote. The icon of the strong Black woman is a bridge between Black women's emotional lives and their politics. African American women perceive and describe themselves as strong, beautiful, independent, and kind, self-definitions that are both positive and powerful. The strong Black woman does battle against the vicious stereotypes of Black women perpetuated by racism and patriarchy. But while she creates the standard for self-improvement and racial empowerment, She also encourages silence in the face of structural barriers. As an orientation toward the world built on a set of beliefs about the intrinsic qualities of African American women and about how those qualities may be appropriately manifested in the way Black women think, speak, and act, the strong Black woman has both emotional and political consequences. What stands out to me from the passages that we just read is the negative political implications that the strong Black woman myth has. I think that with some of the other myths that we went through in the previous chapter, what's the previous chapter? Okay, no, not the previous chapter, but about 2 chapters ago, when we went through some of those stereotypes, some of those myths, it was more obvious, with Mammy and Jezebel and Sapphire. They were more straightforward, the negative impacts that they had. You could see that those myths and stereotypes being perpetuated were being used in an effort to shame Black women, in an effort to further marginalize and further subjugate and exploit Black women. Whereas the strong Black woman myth is one that at its face or on the surface is I personally seen as more of an empowering uh, myth or an empowering ideal. And I have heard Black women and women in general speak about the negative effects of having to be strong all the time, or people believing you're strong when you don't feel like you're strong, or you don't want to have to be strong all the time, or it's just a perception that you're strong when really you are dealing with you have the same weaknesses as everybody else. However, this was the most in depth I've ever seen anybody put it. I like the way that Melissa V. Harris Perry spoke about the political implications these that the strong Black woman myth has. The fact that it lends towards some more conservative policies, that it lends towards more individualized policies, that the accepting of this concept of the strong Black woman uh, does more to hinder Black women who cannot rise above some of their situations because they're not meant to rise above these situations than it does to empower Black women who have risen or may be able to rise above certain situations individually. And I hope that's making sense. Uh, and so how I personally perceived it is that say you had 100 Black women, and let's say 20 of them were going to rise above expectations, 20 of them were going to rise below, or not rise below, but 20 of them were going to succumb to the negative experiences and negative surroundings that are around them, and then you have 60 who are on the fence. I think my thought before would be that the strong Black woman myth will do more to help those 60 women rise up than it will do to stagnate those 60 women or make those 60 women end up succumbing to their circumstances as well. And the way Melissa V. Harris Perry has put it is that the political implications that comes with buying into this strong Black woman myth makes it so that those 60 women are more vulnerable to falling to succumbing to these negative circumstances that surround them, because the policies and procedures that come out from the strong Black woman myth are ones that are individualized and not about collectivism, ones that do not put an emphasis on structural issues but put an emphasis on personal issues. I hope that makes sense. Let's continue reading. I'm going to try to finish this last segment of this chapter up. Strong in the Lord. The icon of the strong Black woman encourages African American women to confront the considerable challenges of their lives independently. Recall that a desire for recognition is a motivating force for participation in public life. Human beings need material goods, but they also need to feel valued and recognized. This is particularly important in a democracy where citizens expect to have an opportunity to voice their interests and have the government respond to those interests. African American women face specific, damaging, and deeply embedded race and gender stereotypes that make it difficult for them to enjoy accurate recognition in the public sphere. The crooked room created by these stereotypes has psychological consequences for individuals and social and political consequences for Black women as a group. The strong Black woman ideal is an attempt to straighten these crooked images. But even though the strong Black woman is a more positive image than Jezebel, Mammy, or Sapphire, she is still inadequate to allow Black women to enjoy the benefits of recognition and therefore to opt into an experience of full citizenship. Still masked behind a facade of impervious strength, Black women remain unable to reveal their fragile humanity. Frances, a 36-year-old woman in my New York focus group, expressed her frustration with the strength imperative. Quote, "Yeah, I am very, very much jaded. You're angry because you are still going. It's so repetitious. Your life has become so," claps hands 3 times. "You know, every day I have to do this. I have to work. I'm working from check to check. It's like things never get better for me. I never experience a progression. I feel like you never get to make that transition over into the real woman. And I think the real woman's life is a whole lot better than being this extra strong soldier woman. I want to be that real woman. I don't want to be a soldier all my life." End quote. Frances's yearning to give up the role of soldier was echoed by another group member who responded, quote, "As a Black woman, I just think people expect so much. Everyone expects a lot from you, especially if you characterize yourself as strong. People believe you never need help when actually you do. People think you never cry." End quote. Although the strong Black woman allows sisters to craft a new role for themselves unconstrained by the most vicious images of the crooked room, they still seek a place where they can be authentic or, quote, "real women," end quote, as Frances describes it. Religious faith, most often expressed through traditions associated with Black Christian churches, is one way that African American women have felt free to admit their vulnerability and seek authenticity. Although they may be reluctant to lean on friends, family, or the state, Black women have wholeheartedly embraced God as a partner in their struggles. Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God" rarely discusses organized religion. The lead character, Janie Mae Crawford, navigates the difficult world of racial and gender misrecognition without explicitly calling on Jesus to help her. But both God and the church are embedded in her story. When the hurricane bears down on her and her companions, they turn their eyes to God. When she expresses her love to Tea Cake, she tells him that God opened a door for her to find happiness. Janie relies on the divine, but she also understands the limitations of the church. Early in the novel, we learn that Janie's grandmother, the one who consigns Janie to a loveless arranged marriage, is herself a woman of God shut out of official religious leadership because of her gender. Quote, "I wanted to reach a great sermon about colored women sitting on high, but there wasn't no pulpit for me." End quote. Without a sanctioned space from which to share her religious vision, Janie's grandmother can barely imagine a life of freedom for a Black woman, and her lack of vision leads her to limit her beloved granddaughter's choices. Perhaps this lack of official opportunity for religious leadership is why Janie does not participate in an organized church. Still, God is present throughout her journey. She consistently finds a purpose greater than herself by engaging the natural and spiritual world around her. One reason Janie is able to stand straight in the crooked room is because she has the mirror of divinity to offer her a clear reflection of who she is. She sums up her story to her friend Phoebe by explaining that every person must, quote, "go to God and they got to find out about living for themselves," end quote. The insight that everyone must go to God is not only about shared mortality, it is also a call to find the divine presence within that gives meaning to life. Faith in God plays a similar role for many African American women. Nadine, an older woman in the Chicago focus group, explained that she perceives God as the source of her strength. After describing some of the difficulties she has lived through, she said, quote, "I think strength is measured by what you endure, what you have to take on. The things that have happened to me in life, the next person may not be able to handle them. And it wasn't because I was so especially strong. I was just me, and I dealt with the things as they came. With God's grace, I made it." End quote. Nadine is testifying to the supportive role of the divine in her life in a way that is very common among African American women. Consider the black spiritual assertion that there is balm in Gilead. Quote, sometimes I feel discouraged and think my work's in vain, but then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. End quote. In the next chapter, I ask whether there truly is a balm in Gilead for African American women. That brings us to the end of chapter 5. My reflections from this chapter and from the segments that we just read, and it sort of came to me as we were reading through the beginning of this last section, Strong in the Lord, at this sentence here. African American women face specific, damaging, and deeply embedded race and gender stereotypes that make it difficult for them to enjoy accurate recognition in the public sphere. The crooked room created by these stereotypes has psychological consequences for individuals and social and political consequences for Black women as a group. The strong Black woman ideal is an attempt to straighten these crooked images. But even though the strong Black woman is a more positive image than Jezebel, Mammy, or Sapphire, she is still inadequate to allow Black women to enjoy the benefits of recognition and therefore to opt into an experience of full citizenship. And that sort of exemplifies the negative aspects or the negative tangible effects that come from stereotypes. Whether a stereotype is something that's positive or something that can be perceived to be positive, or whether it's something that's perceived to be negative, is that it doesn't allow the group that's being stereotyped to have access full citizenship, to be able to, and I'm not going to use this term citizenship, but just a full humanity. It doesn't allow you to be a full person. A stereotype limits the human being. It hinders the human being. It makes it so that somebody has to fit into a square peg might have to fit into a round hole, because that's the only way that people can perceive something. So when you can only perceive Black people to run fast or to be strong or to be angry, you limit the humanity of that Black person. You make it so that even if they are fast, or even if they are strong, or even if they, have something that is part of this stereotype, it comes at a cost. It comes at it's not that you're fast because of something you've done individually or because you trained to be fast. It's fast because you're Black. You're fast because you're Black, which brings you back to all the other connotations that come with being Black, being a thug or being a hoodlum. That's something that was pointed out here too. You can't just opt into the positive connotations or something that may be perceived as a positive stereotype, because you also become susceptible to the negative stereotypes that exist in there as well. And none of those things allow for Black people to experience life as full human beings, specifically Black women. So we're going to end this episode here, and we will be back tomorrow to begin chapter 6, God, in Sister Citizen by Melissa V. Harris Perry.